We'll give everybody a quick second to start rolling in.
So don't forget to mute yourself when you're not speaking to avoid the echoing. Thank you. And Parker, let me know when I should go, okay?
You are good to start.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining our panel discussion. Structural racism, civil disobedience, and path to social justice. As a Dean of Culture, Arts, and Letters, it is my honor to welcome you to our panel featuring panelists from various diverse racial and ethnic background and discipline in our college. This Cal Talk series features timely issues that concern all of us. As a recent article in LA Times stated, we are now at the precipice of the Black Lives Matter revolution. And to end racial injustice, we need to work together. All racial backgrounds, all people from different background, culture background, and discipline, we should all work together to end racial injustice. And therefore, this panel is very important for us as educators to address our own personal experience and our professional experience in dealing with racism. And also as an educator, we'll provide our feedback and our suggestion for the path to more racially just society. And as you know, racial injustice permeates throughout the entire history of the United States. That create a lot of historical trauma. Take, for example, Native Americans' Trail of Tears. Therefore, I would first like to acknowledge the land that we use on our campus. San Bernardino sits on the territory and ancestral land of San Manuel Band of Mission Indian. We recognize that every member of the Cal State San Bernardino community has benefited and continue to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1965. Consistent with our value of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and make visible the university's relationship to Native people. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold our university more accountable to the needs of American Indian and indigenous people. This panel discussion seeks to address different issues that we're all facing as educators and scholars. And we also welcome your feedback. So we welcome you to use Q&A session so we could have dialogic conversation. I'm very thankful for each panelist's contribution to this timely discussion. Without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Shafiqur Rahman, Chair of Communication Studies, who will serve as the moderator for today's discussion. And he will then introduce each of our panelists. So Dr. Rahman.
You're muted. Shafiq, you're muted.
Okay, hey, thank you. Thank you, Liliana. Thank you, Dr. Chuang, for this nice introduction and for organizing this important and timely talk. Today, as Dr. Chuang said, we have an impressive panel drawn from different academic departments and of diverse scholarly backgrounds. Hopefully, the panelists will engage with our topic by dissecting and deconstructing different aspects of structural racism, and maybe they will also shed some light on the prospect of achieving racial justice following the protests that's going on in this country and throughout the world. The coronavirus pandemic has been upending the lives of people throughout the world for the past few months. In the US, the pandemic is disproportionately impacting the lives of Black people. This exposes the structural racism that systematically denies and restricts access to wealth and healthcare to a large number of Black people. I hope our panelists will explore this further in their discussions. The coronavirus pandemic did not stop another deep-rooted vice of American society, that is police brutality directed at Black people that resulted in many deaths and trauma in Black community. 4 officers, as you know, from the Minneapolis Police Department murdered a 46-year-old Black man named George Floyd in broad daylight. We have seen in video with trauma clips that Derek Chauvin kneeled on George Floyd's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds that ultimately killed him. This brutal killing triggered nationwide protest demanding justice and reform in policing. I'm sure our panelists will decipher the meaning of these ongoing protests and their implications for establishing justice in our country. But before I invite the panelists, I want to talk a little bit about myself, perhaps shedding some light on my own journey to this topic. I migrated to US a few years before 9/11. However, the post 9/11 America has largely shaped my academic life and the life of my family. I was appalled to see widespread demonization of brown Muslims in mediated discourse post 9/11. This prompted me to write my doctoral dissertation and later publish a book on this topic. The topic is the effects of post 9/11 backlash on Bangladeshi diaspora in the United States. When working on my dissertation, I came across scholarly and activist writing that drew a parallel between the experience of brown Muslims and Black people. After 9/11, people they were saying that the experiences of Muslims have become the new Black in America. While I did not like that the Black experience should be used as a template to discuss other people's experience, nonetheless, I saw a parallel between the experiences of brown Muslim and the Black people post 9/11. In both cases, the whole community was primarily portrayed as a problem population that threatened national security and the law and order of the land. Therefore, those populations must be controlled or managed by using brutal force, intimidation, and state-sanctioned surveillance. Consequently, the discourse of national security and immigration has been racialized and weaponized against racial minorities, including Blacks, Latinx, and Native American population. I will conclude my remarks by recalling 2 personal experiences. Just to make a point that how this racialized discourse actually take a toll on the life of minorities. So before the 2016 presidential election, we were on a campus tour to choose a college for our daughter. I remember vividly, we checked in our hotel room and turned the TV and heard a presidential candidate saying, "Islam hates America." Within a moment, our mood turned sour, and we spent the rest of the night thinking about our daughter's future in this country. On election night, after the results were announced and the candidate I mentioned won, I received a phone call from my daughter. She was extremely upset because a group of white students began chanting "Build the Wall" as they saw her walking in her dorm room, in the hallway of her dorm room. By sharing this, I am not equating my experience with the experience of Black parents who constantly need to think whether their children will come home safely or not, or the trauma that many documented and undocumented immigrants experience when their families were separated. One thing that I have learned is that we should not make assumptions about the experiences minorities go through. Rather, we should listen to and understand the pain, the trauma, and stand by them to materialize racial justice in this country. This panel will provide opportunity and space for speaking, listening, and understanding on an issue that is plaguing our society for such a long time. We have two broad questions for our panelists to address today. These are that the panelists' own personal lived and professional experiences as educators and scholars on racism, prejudice, and discrimination in the age of COVID-19, and what they can do as educators and scholars to help our students and address racial politics and social unrest in the age of COVID-19. With that, let's invite our panelists. I now invite Dr. Larry Hygh Jr., Lecturer, Communication Studies Department. Dr. Hygh.
Good afternoon, beautiful people. Thank you, Dr. Chuang, for this space to share both my professional and personal experience as a Black man in this country and exploring how we might be poised to help empower and lift up our students to navigate this critical moment for the sake of our nation's future. I trace both sides of my family's history in the United States back to slavery. My paternal great-great-great-grandfather, Sam Hygh, was born a slave in South Carolina and was sold to a slaveholder who resided in East Texas. After slavery, he returned to South Carolina to get his family before coming back to settle in Karnak, Texas. My maternal great-great-grandfather, Ned Moon, was enslaved in Macon, Georgia, and migrated to Ore City, Texas after slavery, and married my great-great-grandmother, who was Native American, Caddo Indian. To this day, our family still owns the land they purchased in East Texas post-slavery. I am always reminded that I come from strong, resilient people who have survived tremendous obstacles and have thrived in this country. They were the direct descendants of those who were captured, bought, and brought from the African continent to Jamestown, Virginia in 1619 to pick cotton and tobacco. Both of my grandfathers served in the United States Army and in World War II. In 1945, they came back to their country to be told to sit in the back of the bus, drink from colored water fountains, and that separate was equal. You don't get to tell me or anyone else in my family how we should salute a flag or how we should feel about an anthem that upon their creation did not fully intend to include or to cover us. For the past several weeks, I have vacillated between a spirit of hopelessness for our current situation and a spirit of hope. Like most people, my spirit has been troubled by the videos I have seen, but most Black people have not been surprised by them. This is not new. Black folks have been terrorized in this country for more than 400 years. Black folks were tortured to get here and have continued to be tortured since our arrival, whether by laws or by the lawless. These deaths are not new. Actor Will Smith says racism is not new. It's being filmed. What's new is public discourse about what we have known all along as reality in Black communities. As a 44-year-old Black man in America, I have experiences of being profiled and followed in stores, pulled over in my sports car for driving while Black. My parents have had the talk with me that so many other Black parents have had to have with their Black sons and daughters. No one with Black or brown hues are immune to this torturous violence. Degrees nor pedigree insulates us from it. For 20 years prior to CSUSB, I worked for the United Methodist Church, which is a global denomination with 12 million members, but predominantly white in the US with 7 million members, and the other 5 million on the African continent, Europe, and Asia. Even in the church that has its basic tenets of justice, compassion, and mercy, I have seen institutional and systemic racism firsthand. In fact, if you take note of the clergy to whom Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail was written, it includes the name of 2 Methodist bishops. Working for a year for the Black AIDS Institute, I saw the healthcare disparities that plague Black people and people of color in the US. These disparities are a result of a society and a system that is built with racism as a foundation. A claim that equality solves the problem is a false narrative. You can't have good health care or self-care when you live in poverty, a food desert, or a neighborhood without jobs that will employ our people. The 1955 Mississippi lynching of Emmett Lewis Till helped to galvanize the modern civil rights movement. It was his mother, Mamie Till Bradley, who insisted that an open coffin exposing the world to her son's bloated and mutilated body be seen. I keep hoping that this is our Emmett Till moment. This is the Emmett Till moment for our generation. What if the image of that racist officer's knee choking the life out of our brother George Floyd's body is our Emmett Till moment? What if this is the catalyst for galvanizing real change? I have been moved by the calls, emails, and texts from my white friends. They have asked me, how am I doing? What can I do to be supportive of you during this time? And most importantly, what can we do to collectively move forward and create systemic change? I have more questions than answers, and hopefully more stamina than anxiety. I don't have the answers. I do know that this is not the time for any of us to be insular in our groups and assume or claim that this has nothing to do with us. It's time for us to break down some walls and to do some cross-pollination and collectively come together, because that is the only hope we have that we might move forward together. As I told Dean Chuang when she extended the invitation to me, I cannot and I will not separate who I innately am from this discussion. I am a person of deep faith, and I am a product of the Black church and a child of liberation theology. I have been influenced specifically by Black liberation theology and the writings of James Cone and Howard Thurman. I have been influenced by the work of civil rights leader and Quaker Bayard Rustin. Everyone always wants to quote the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. without acknowledging that first and foremost, he was a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ. The calls for justice he issued came from a biblical mandate and a faith that insisted that God is on the side of the oppressed. I approach life as a product of the Black church and a child of liberation theology. For the past 20 plus years, I have been in the people empowerment and people uplift business. As I made a career transition last year, one of the things that attracted me to Cal State San Bernardino is the university's vision statement. It says CSUSB aspires to be a model for transforming lives. My friends, that means that we are in the life transformation business. During this time of chaos in our nation, everyone seems to put out a statement. Everyone seems to want to have a panel discussion. Everyone right now is standing up with Black folks. And I want to challenge us today so that this panel discussion might be different. It's great that folks will stand up with us. It's great that folks will stand up with Black people, but I don't need you to only stand up with us. I need you to move. I need you to move this afternoon. I need you to move into the positions that you occupy in the academic setting and in civic society, and take concrete actions to name your own and to confront white privilege and to destroy the tools that perpetuate systemic racism. Sure, race is a social construct, but racism has been constructed on the backs of Black and brown bodies and communities for far too long. I don't need you to stand this afternoon. I need you to move. Move so no one is pressing on another man or woman's neck, snuffing out their breath because they are of a darker hue. I need you to move into the spaces that you occupy and resist police brutality, fight for living wages, fight for affordable housing, fight for access for all to affordable health care. I need you to call out discrimination in the workplace and dismantle systemic racism, because when it benefits you, it harms another. I need you to examine your own isms and phobias, because they go with you everywhere you go. When they don't serve the greater good, move away from them. I don't need you to stand this afternoon. I need you to move. I want us to move beyond discussion into direct action. I want to ask the question, what is one concrete thing that you can do this week in the fight against dismantling systemic racism? What is one concrete thing that you can do this week in the fight against dismantling systemic racism? As a person of faith, I echo the words of Pastor Evans. Racism isn't a bad habit. It isn't a mistake. It is sin. The answer is not sociology. it's theology. The work I do comes from a tradition which says, we must act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. We must act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with our God. I don't need you to stand this afternoon. I need you to move.
Thank you, Dr. Hygh. Thank you, Larry, for this really inspiring presentation. So I probably should have told that we have 9 panelists, and I will read their names and as I invite them. And for the members in the audiences, please use Q&A feature. If you have a question, please post your question as you listen to the presentation. And then if your question is directed to a particular panelist, please mention that so that we can ask that question to that particular panelist. So with that, and I believe Dr. Hygh is done, am I right? Right, okay. Okay, so our next presenter is Dr. Oraib Mango.
Yes, hi and good afternoon.
I'm sorry, Dr.
Yes.
Oraib is a professor in the Department of World Language and Literature.
Yes, thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Hygh, for this for setting us off wonderfully like this. As I share my thoughts today, I would like to highlight the powerful ideas and theories of prominent Black scholars, such as Michelle Alexander, author of The New Jim Crow, and Ibram Kendi, author of Stamped from the Beginning. And he has a brand new book that's just been released today, Anti-Racist Baby. These scholars, they see systems of oppression today as a continuation of the same systems that justified slavery and Jim Crow policies. Today, the system justifies mass incarceration and inequitable access to basic human rights. In the words of Michelle Alexander, we have not ended racial caste in America. We have merely redesigned it. This system of oppression against Blacks stems from the racist idea, argues Kendi, that there is something wrong with Black people. The system casts them as inferior, uncivilized, and unequal to whites. The system is maintained through dominant, powerful rhetoric and persistent media images that criminalize them. Politicians manipulate media images and rhetoric to spread fear of crimes and justify violation of human rights for their own political and economic gains. After all, who would not want the state to be tough on crime? Who would not want the state to be tough on drugs or to have a war on terror? Day in, day out, we see media images normalizing the stopping, throwing against the wall, frisking, and locking up of Black youth. Studies show that Blacks are not more likely to use drugs than whites, but we never see images of white youth frisked, paraded in handcuffs, and thrown in prison. As a result, we start to associate crime with Black bodies, with Black and brown people. Because of the horrors of slavery, Jim Crow, and continuing state violence against African Americans, they bore and continue to bear the brunt of a racist system. It's the same system that casts immigrants and racialized communities as a threat and a problem in need of fixing. Under guise of keeping the country safe, we have witnessed people being rounded up, stripped of their human rights, thrown in prisons. Many are deported with their children kept in cages and separated from their families. How can the war on crime justify the state's crimes against Blacks? How does that even make sense? How can the state's war on terror justify terrorizing people? How can the state claim to care about families and youth when it crushes them and tears them apart? Just like everyone else, I live within the system on a daily basis. And just like many of our students, I'm constantly bombarded by violent images and rhetoric that casts me and the groups that I belong to as a problem. I'm expected to fit media images to an exact T. I'm a racialized other, expected to strive to gain the approval of the white gaze, but without ever getting fully equitable status, not under the current system. In my everyday life, I'm expected to nicely and graciously respond to racist questions and insinuations thrown at me while doing the most mundane activities, shopping, exercises, exercising, or even when getting my mail or crossing the street. In academia, I am thankful to have allies and people I could turn to for help. The subtle and at times not so subtle images I get in academia are usually centered around compliance. I'm expected to comply without questioning authority, even in the face of perceived injustice. Here are a few examples. I was told that it was not in my best interest to challenge evaluations and write rebuttals. I was criticized as not being collegial when I demanded to be held to the same standards as my colleagues. I was accused of being offensive when merely voicing an opinion that was stated freely by others without admonition. I see all of these incidents as pieces in the continuing legacy of systemic racism that seeks to control the actions and bodies of people of color. My message to my students and everybody else is to heed the call of Michelle Alexander for all of us to face our racial history and racial present. We must resist and challenge the discourses that cast racialized communities as unequal or a problem that needs fixing. Just as my colleague just mentioned, it's time for us to collectively come together, regardless of our backgrounds, and join social movements that aim at building a new and just system. I encourage students to get involved in politics at the local level, to influence who gets elected, and to run for offices to effect change in the community. We must do the work. Blacks, Indigenous, and people of color are tired of having to justify their existence and even their right to breathe. Black people in particular are not just figuratively, but also literally suffocating under this violent system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mango, for this presentation. Let me just remind our panelists that you have 5 minutes to speak initially, and then you will have opportunity to speak during the Q&A session. So with that, now I invite Dr. Rong Chen, Professor of Department of English. Dr. Chen.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman, and thank you for the invitation. And I want to make 2 points. And join the panel because I was asked to kind of talk about racism from the perspective of an Asian person. So as an Asian person, first I want to make 1 point, and the same point that has been made by the previous panelists, that is racism is systemic, is institutional, is historical, and exists in all shapes and forms. They may look different, we may have different experiences, but fundamentally it's the same thing. On the Asian side, for example, there is the famous or infamous Chinese Exclusion Act that actually is probably the only constitution that is against a particular group. And as we know, there's a Chinese, the interning of Japanese Americans during the Second World War and all these other things. And currently during COVID-19, Chinese in particular, but I think Asian, because generally people cannot tell Asians tell us apart. And the Chinese and Asians probably has been spat at, has been pushed over, has been blamed for spreading, for causing this pandemic to the humankind. And so, having said that, my point is to affirm the point that racism is systemic. I do want to come back to Dr. Hygh's point, and Dr. Hygh is absolutely right to call for action, to call for movement. Don't just talk and move and do something. My view in this point, at this point is, so I've said about very briefly about Asian experience here, but I also of the opinion that one way for me to move is actually not to dwell on the strives of myself, because this is a historical moment, and this moment belongs to Black Lives Matter. I believe that if I dwell on too much of my experience, it's going to probably serve unintentionally take the attention away from what we should be talking about, which is the racism against Blacks in particular, although it's racism against all of us. So I would also, so my point is, I think a movement has momentum. A movement needs attention. A movement needs a particular involvement and commitment. My commitment is to stand behind Black brothers and sisters and do whatever it takes to support you. And then when it comes to another occasion, I will stress, for example, Asian experience, the need to fight for racial equality for the Asian people. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience.
Thank you, Dr. Rong Chen, for making that call that we need to stand behind our Black brothers and sisters in this fight. Thank you. So our next panelist is Dr. Nicholas Bratcher. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Music.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Nick Bratcher from the Department of Music. Thank you first to Dr. Chuang for allowing this panel discussion and allowing us to find ways that we can assist with our students as well as with our own shortcomings when it comes to racial division and diversity and inclusion during this age of COVID-19. I admit that this was difficult at first. I got this invitation about a week and a half prior to school ending, and teaching courses through virtual learning was a challenge for me, seeing daily in the news almost. It was after the death of George Floyd, the reminders of Ahmaud Arbery, the young man who was running in southern Georgia and was brutally murdered, Breonna Taylor and her husband, who were attacked while she was in her home sleeping. And the many Black trans people who have been killed throughout. The young woman who thought that she would be able to call police in a New York park for African-American male who was bird watching because she did not wish to put her dog on a leash, and how dare, he confront her about such an issue. And so to be able to maintain a positive attitude with students as I teach an art form, as I teach music to them, the best way I can via distance learning was very challenging. A bit of background on myself. I am born and raised in the state of South Carolina, so I grew up in a southern state. I went to a high school that in my freshman year was in its 25th year of integration from Brown versus the Board of Education. And when Congress said with all deliberate speed that schools should integrate, South Carolina took that to mean take their sweet time. Sadly, there are still schools in the South that have yet to integrate to this very day. That tradition at Friday night football games at high schools is still a thing. If you go to that high school on a Friday night, there are all of the white spectators sitting on one side of the stadium and all of the Black spectators sitting on the other side of the stadium. And that's the way it's been. Like my colleague said earlier, when I would go and shop in stores, I would never have to look for a store associate because one was always following me. I have very, very healthy family lines. So I am a 6 foot tall, 270 pound Black male. And even in the world of academia, when I say that I'm a college professor, the first thing I get is usually a coach of some kind or working in kinesiology. Never somebody who teaches music or much less as a conductor. So I guess the part here that I want to bring up is that we are all frustrated. We are all looking for ways that we can help in this situation. And one of the biggest parts for me that I try so hard to share with my students is to find experiences from people who look like them. When I wanted to become a music educator, most of the teachers that I had growing up did not look like me. Most of the conductors that I see for symphony orchestras, for bands, do not look like me. And if you find any Black professors that are music educators within the college profession, they're few and far between at predominantly white institutions, and most of them are restricted to historically Black colleges and universities. So none of those of which have terminal degrees in music or any of the other arts. So my thing is, let's expose our students, Black and brown students, to experiences in their field with people who look like them, people who talk like them, because all of us here have been fortunate enough to earn degrees in the arts, in foreign languages, arts and humanities that our students want to do, and we're looked at as role models to them. So my goal is to make sure that we have experiences for those students through this world, something to get them through, something to look forward to, and to give them hope, as Dr. Hygh said earlier, with everything that's been going on. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Dr. Nick Bratcher, for your presentation. And I see we have about 90 participants, so that's an impressive number, but we only have 1 or 2 questions. So I encourage people to ask questions. Just an announcement that Dr. Mango, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Bratcher, they will leave to attend another meeting, but the rest of the panel will stay. So our next panelist is Dr. Christy Papailler, Assistant Professor, Department of Theater Arts. Okay, it's your turn.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate on this panel, and thank you so much for all the work that you're doing around having this conversation and diversity inclusion in the workplace, as well as anti-racism. I'm a theater professor, and this is my first year here at CSUSB. I'm from Louisville, Kentucky, and I grew up in a household that grounded me in anti-racism, as well as always let me know that white supremacy was a fallacy, right? That white supremacy is something that does not really, that's not true. And that's because my father, Dr. Hubert Papailler, was a professor emeritus in modern languages and Pan-African studies at the University of Louisville. And previously he had been an ambassador and minister of education. He had been the Haitian ambassador and minister of education under Duvalier, and he was the ambassador to Uruguay. And his promotion from Minister of Education to being the ambassador to Uruguay came after he spoke out against colorism in Duvalier's dictatorship. And he married my mother, Letitia Papailler, who was from a very small town in Eastern Kentucky and was the direct descendant of people who had been enslaved in Eastern Kentucky. And later went on to become the director of the Kentucky Commission on Human Rights. So I grew up in a world of traveling in the car with my mother through the hills of Eastern Kentucky as she went to investigate cases of racial and sexual discrimination. So always for me, and my father always insisted that we read a lot and that we wrote a lot and that we analyzed things that happened to us. And they were always there for us when we faced discrimination in small town Kentucky over and over and over again. They were always there for us at the school. One of the things that taught me is that no matter what your foundation is, there is still this huge flaw in the education system that centralizes the Western and the white experience and leaves out the experience of people of color, right? So there is this huge gap in what many people learn that only serves to feed the fallacy of white supremacy, and is something that is completely injurious to the fabric of the United States of America, hence, and has global implications as we see today. One of the things I noticed that really disturbed me was this narrative of African Americans are more susceptible to COVID-19. And the way in which the care that I saw people taking around wearing masks or social distancing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, changed as soon as it seemed like, oh, well, okay, if I'm not African American or over a certain age or whatever, right? They would, once white people were able to remove themselves from the risk category, the risk seemed to increase for the rest of us. And I think that we began to see that, right, through the drop in social distancing and various precautions, as well as in the way that the healthcare system continued to neglect many African American patients, and also the way that the psychological impact on African American people who may have been ill, but because of this country's history of racism in the healthcare system, resisted going into the hospital. I also found it interesting that left out of that narrative was, what is the percentage of essential workers who are at this point then keeping the country going, right, who were African American? We heard a lot about, oh, well, you've got diabetes and you've got this, these things that make it very easy to blame victims, though we know that the causes of those are multifaceted, including the fact that that the American Psychological Association has said that the experience of real or perceived racism is experienced psychologically as trauma in the body. And we know that there are also biological diseases that then can be caused from that kind of stress and trauma. So it was very concerning to me to hear that the narrative was, oh, African Americans are more susceptible because of poor diets, and we didn't expand the conversation along that out from that in an official way, nor acknowledge the fact that a high percentage of essential workers who were in healthcare working to keep people safe, working to keep people healthy, working to save lives, were in fact of African descent. So that's my personal experience of it. As an educator, one of the things that I found necessary to do was to continue to decolonize the material that I'm teaching in the class. I taught theater history, the last level theater history 3 this quarter. And I found that I would be remiss if in this kind of climate, and I really, for me pedagogically, it's part of my value system to always teach what are the socio-political conditions under which this art was created, and how did this art go on to influence later socio-political conditions. And so as we studied Susan Laurie Park's America play, right, we talked about the riots that happened in 1990, that was preceded by the LA riots. As we talked about Twilight Los Angeles, that then was preceded by talking about the civil rights movement and the many movements that had led up to folks finally being able to take a stand against police brutality. And so my recommendation, or my request, I think, is that we continue to decolonize our curriculum, that curriculum be culturally responsive. So anytime we are teaching history, that we include, that we make sure that we are teaching the full story, and that we are not teaching it from the Eurocentric perspective, which is very limited and leaves our students ill-prepared to compete in a global market. I'm gonna end with this quote from Carter G. Woodson, and that is, "Those who have no record of what their forebears have accomplished lose the inspiration which comes from the teaching of biography and history. And we know that the omission of that, right, is systemic, is intentional, and is something that is embedded in the system in order to continue the disenfranchisement of indigenous and people of color. So my request, I think, to educators is that we resist that by telling the more complete history, by including including in our lessons that are reflective of the true contribution of people of all colors in our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Christy Papailler, for your presentation. Our next presenter is Dr. Ahlam Muhtaseb, Professor Communication Studies Department. Dr. Muhtaseb.
Yes, good evening. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First, I would like to acknowledge that I work and I live on the indigenous land of the Pechanga band of Louisiana Indians, and these lands are colonized. I would like also to start by acknowledging that, that I acknowledge also my privilege as a white passing woman of color. So today, I could focus on my own experience facing racism intersectionally, actually, because of my identity and because of my race and my gender. But in light of, agreeing with Dr. Larry Hygh, I would like to actually to focus the discussion more on the struggle, the current struggle of our Black brothers and sisters. And so I would like to talk about the historical origins of police brutality and how it became an extension to this slavery legacy. There are some important conversations actually in the nation nowadays about the militarization of the police and its political economic enablers, which is also connected to other topics like the militarization of borders. But very little is known or discussed in mainstream America about the topic that I would like to address today, which is the global forms, which are the global forms of militarization, especially what we term in our activist circles as the deadly exchange. I will address the topic in more details tomorrow because I don't have a lot of time today. We will have the race forum, the campus-wide race forum, and part of the discussion between me and Dr. Robin Kelly from UCLA is actually going to focus on deadly exchange. So today is probably going to be only an introduction, and I would like to answer any questions if we have time in the Q&A. So this started with a coalition of different activist organizations and group led by Jewish Voice for Peace a few years ago, and I was part of that coalition, especially after Ferguson, when they started a very serious conversation on that deadly exchange. The Alliance at that time issued, years later actually, issued a report prepared by a research group called Researching the American-Israeli Alliance. The 57-page report details US law enforcement training at the hands of the Israeli military. And it also discusses other related topics such as exchange of information, surveillance on Americans, and of course, Palestinian citizens as well, and use of force. Now, I just wanna make a disclaimer that I'm focusing only on one aspect of the militarization of the US police, and that there are other aspects, but this one is where I actually was very involved in, so that's why I'm focusing on it. American policing is the story of anti-Black racism in this country. The first police were slave patrols. The Black codes, I invite everyone to go and actually read about that, were designed to limit freedom for newly liberated slaves, were created during Reconstruction and still linger in state and federal laws. And the first industrial complex incarcerates, the prison industrial complex incarcerates Black people at over 5 times the rate of white people. Actually, for a good report on the history and evolution of the police in the US, I highly recommend NPR's Throughline podcast titled American Police. There is another one that preceded it called, it was about mass incarceration, which was also excellent. But this is the kind of investigative reporting that we really need. Again, it's a podcast by NPR called Throughline, and the title for this specific episode was American Police. Traces down, like the evolution and history of American police. So from the creation of American police, they have been in the business of surveilling and quelling reports, protest movements, especially Black-led organizing and resistance. And in recent decades, we have witnessed the police's increasingly militarized tactics. The process of militarizing our police forces is rooted first and foremost in America's war making all over the world, which includes funding and supporting for other repressive regimes like Israel's brutal military occupation in Palestine. Technology practices and weapons that the US uses against Black and brown people abroad come back to American streets and are important into other countries. Money leads back in, or lands back in American arms corporations, and those weapons and tactics land back on US streets. Just look at the images, comparing the police forces nowadays in their tanks and, full military gear versus those in the 1950s or before. Not saying that the police was not brutal at that time, but I'm just talking about this notion of the militarization, even visually, to intimidate and to harass and to violate. Police exchange programs solidify partnerships between the US and other governments, including Israel, and facilitate a two-way exchange in methods and equipment for state violence and control, including mass surveillance, racial profiling, which I have been the victim of, and I'm sure most of you probably here on the panel have been, and suppression of protest and dissent. In the case of Israel, it started after 9/11 as a counter-terrorism exchange. The first delegation included chiefs and deputy chiefs of police departments in California, Texas, Maryland, Florida, New York, and agents from the FBI, the CIA, and future officers of ICE, and director of security at even the MTA in New York City, which is, the Transportation Authority. Participants were schooled in Israeli military approaches to intelligence gathering, border security, checkpoints, and coordination with the media, which is very crucial because look at the framing of everything that is happening in the United States and the mainstream media. They get training even on how to frame the narratives of police brutality. And met with high-ranking officials in the Israeli police and military, the Shin Bet, which is the Israeli intelligence, internal intelligence, and the Ministry of Defense. Since then, US law enforcement exchange programs with Israel have become standard, with hundreds of American law enforcement officials from across the country going to Israel for training, and thousands more participating in security conferences and workshops with Israeli personnel in the United States. These exchange programs with Israel facilitates the sharing of practices and technologies between US law enforcement and the Israeli military, police and intelligence agencies. Instill militarized logics of security into the civilian sphere, normalizing practices of mass surveillance, criminalizations, and the violent repression of communities and movements the government defines as threatening, and deepen ties between US and Israeli officials to shore up support for a shared security model that justifies flagrant human and civil rights violations. Tomorrow I will discuss this in more details because I don't have any more time, but I would like to end by a call to action, which is to really consider seriously the movement to defund the police which is the first step really into abolishing the police system as it exists now and its military ties into restorative justice system that is community-based and that provides social programs, especially to marginalized and underserved communities. Instead of policing them, support them. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Muhtaseb, for talking about one of the issues that we usually don't want to talk. Okay, thank you. Okay, so we have still 3 more panelists to go. So now I invite Dr. Esteban Cordoba.
Thank you, Dr. Rahman, and I want to thank Dr. Chuang for organizing this wonderful panel and the panelists who have been so eloquent in discussing these issues. And it's intimidating because I don't think I'm going to be that eloquent. And but I've been thinking about about the questions that were posed to the panelists, and I wanted to start off by just going from the personal to the more professional experience. And just a brief note, I've lived in different countries. I've lived in Mexico, I lived in Brazil, I lived in Chile, I lived in Spain, and my time in these countries have have shaped the way that I see racism and discrimination in many different ways, and the way that it's manifested in different spaces and different spheres. And that's something that allowed me, or that informed my interest in what I did during my doctoral research, which was, since I'm a professor of literature, was representations of Los Angeles in the 1930s and 40s by Latin American authors. And why is that? Because when I read about the city in which I grew up in LA, despite having lived in these other places, I saw that there was a very narrow-minded and a very problematic way of presenting the city that really neglected and disregarded different experiences of different peoples. And that was a moment that I saw how the creation, why 1930s, 1940s was so important in the creation of the imaginary of Los Angeles, was because it was during this time in which Los Angeles, as we know today, was created. The freeway city that really shaped and transformed the way that civil life is presented, is lived day by day by the people, by the citizens of the city, and how that creation of space was spurred by racist, xenophobic agendas and rhetoric. And that's something that really connecting it to the era of COVID-19, something that became more visible was in what I have done in this research, and even though it's literary, but I think it has profound implications in the way that we move along in our day-to-day lives, was the manner in which, for example, news anchors covered and described what was happening during the protests around Los Angeles. You know, the rhetoric, the language, people descending from different neighborhoods into Beverly Hills, into the Fairfax district, into Santa Monica, and the way that the police and the National Guard were displaced, it showed that the city, that the design actually works in that regard, that it works to actually suppress movement and to isolate peoples from different parts of Los Angeles from these more affluent areas. And I think that's been something that's been troubling to me, and also going to different parts of Los Angeles, you know, as simple as going to supermarkets and in different parts of the city, you know, more affluent, more Black or Latino population parts of the city, and how the supermarkets, for example, how they're handling the situation and the inequity in it. And to bring it to the professional, and to the question, these are just thoughts that I've been having, and I'm still processing them, is what to do about this in our classrooms, given what's happening today. And I think I have more questions than I do have answers, but I think it's important not to insulate our classes from what's happening. Bring into the fore, bring into the classroom, and I think contextualizing. I think Dr. Papailler, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name, but I think she's completely right, and that's something that I try to do in my classes, which is decolonize the curriculum, provide different perspectives, not this Eurocentric perspective, and give them space to actually talk about the legacy and the context. This is not something that just happening out of thin air, you know, but it does have a history, and we do need to contextualize the current situation, and I think Dr. Hygh is right. I think it's time for action, and I do hope that we can spur our students into that positive change that we want to see in society today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Esteban Cordoba. I should have mentioned that Dr. Cordoba is an assistant professor in the Department of World Languages and Literature. And I also should mention that the participants, it seems that we have about 5 questions, but they are actually posting resources in the chat room for our panelists. Thank you very much for your participation. So now let me invite Dr. Eric Garcia, Assistant Professor, Department of Philosophy.
Hello, everybody. I want to thank Dean Chuang for this opportunity to talk about these things. And a lot of folks have talked about the state of affairs, but I'll say a little bit about myself and then really just focus on maybe a little bit about what racial justice would look like. Because I think most folks on this panel know a little bit about what racial injustice involves. So I was born to immigrant parents in New York City, in Manhattan, raised in Jackson Heights, Queens during the 80s and 90s and early 2000s, and saw plenty of the assault of the NYPD and just the mass incarceration of people who I grew up with. So I'll just leave that to one side. I think if you just take into account one fact, then what racial justice might look like will suggest itself. So if you actually try to do a counting of all the value of unpaid slave labor that enslaved Africans contributed to the wealth of the United States, then all of the underpaid labor since emancipation, and then the lack of opportunity for gaining wealth and home loans and acquiring property and wealth through in those kinds of ways that Black folks, and I'm just talking about Black folks, have been precluded from. That, according to many economists and philosophers of race, is that value, and when you compound the interest, is more than the entire wealth of the United States, which is the wealthiest country in the history of planet Earth. So that's just, to me, I always take that to be a staggering fact about the immense contribution that Black Americans have made to the United States, that when you actually think about that, think about what it would take to repair just that. And that's not saying anything about Native American folks, Mexican American folks, Asian contributions. We're just talking about Black folks, and that amount is likely more than the total wealth of the United States today. So what does that suggest as far as a solution? Well, I think it suggests that you need to change, you need a major transfer of wealth, or at the very least, you need to change the material conditions of Black folk, brown folk, people of color in general, if you expect anything approaching racial justice to be the case in the United States, right? So, and then I just want to say something. So if that's the case, if material conditions are what need to change, now I want to say something a little bit about what we can do here, kind of echoing what Larry pointed out, what we can actually do as, say, educators, right? What we can do is when we're evaluating our students, right, who are largely students of color, right, we need to think about, well, think about that staggering fact of the transfer of wealth from just Black folks to white folks in the United States, and think about how that explains why students come into college underprepared, right? So when you're evaluating a student and you think, oh, well, they just can't write well. Well, it's not that they can't write well. It's that they went to schools that just didn't prepare them, with students who, with teachers who just are underpaid or didn't care. I mean, and to give you a small anecdote, I had a student in my office in my first quarter at CSUSB. This is my first year here. And she was a woman of color. And she basically told me that her political science professor told her she could never become a lawyer, right? On the basis of no information. And I mean, if you ask me, it's because she was a woman of color. So that just speaks a little bit to the way maybe students of color who are suffering from just severely underserved schools and communities are being evaluated by educators like us, by professors like us. So when we go in for evaluation and we're trying to help our students, I think we need to really keep in mind that where our students are coming from, right? Our students are not often coming from the same place that a lot of the educators at CSUSB, frankly, are coming from. So that's just when Larry talks about, or Professor Hygh, talks about, changing things. There's all kinds of little things that if we all contributed at the same time in propping up students of color, we might be able to make a little bit of a difference here and there. But I just wanted to go from just the staggering facts of racial injustice to maybe small ways that collectively could make a difference to our students. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garcia. Our last panelist, but definitely not the least, Dr. Liliana Conlisk Gallegos, just tenured, newly promoted associate professor, my department of Communication Studies. Okay.
Thank you, everyone.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Shafiq. Okay, well, 5 freaking minutes. Okay, it's really hard to talk everything and say everything that I need to tell you in 5 minutes. It's just impossible. I sent a letter. I'm sure most of you received it. I sent this to the entire campus. Some bounced back because I cannot send emails through some venues. You know, there have been whatever filters, borders, digital borders. I'm from Tijuana. I'm from the border. Nowhere, I cannot remember a single freaking day that I've not experienced bullshit that comes from ignorant people and people who just do not have a clue of how the way that they act and do things and say things perpetuates racism and sexism and homophobia, which is literally, all these experiences are linked, right? They are linked to white supremacy and hierarchical thinking. If you think about it, homosexuality, what is it? It should not be. You should be straight, the shoulds. Those are the things that kill us. Those are the things that, people cannot quite seem to go beyond this vision. And this is because, as I explained in my letter, racism is institutionalized, yes, but it's also individual, right? Because individually we're receiving these messages, these ideas, and then we're perpetuating without even noticing. But when we notice, do we do something about it? Or do we just pretend, right? I know I've also traveled all over the world. I lived in Korea, I lived in Europe, I lived in Russia, I lived in Brazil, Mexico, and all these places that I went, they only made me realize how effed up racism is here. It made me realize how bad it is, right? And I'm speaking to you as a person of color, a brown person who has also been chased around. When I go out to stores, people stare at me to see if I'm gonna steal something, right? Or who assume but I teach Spanish because I can't teach anything else. I teach Spanish. That's all I can be, a professor of Spanish. And we're fed up. I could not watch the entire video of George Floyd's murder and torture. It was too much for me. It's just like, and it's nothing new. It's just like, it's like the drop that made the whole glass fall and spill over. And this hasn't happened. It's not the first time it happens. The water has flowed over before, right? Civil rights movements. We had Chicanos, we had Filipinos, we had African Americans, we had Puerto Ricans working together, right, to fight these this bullshit. That again, it's something that is following us from colonization, from time colonization, and has been perpetuated through empire building in the United States. This all sounds like blah blah blah, right? But again, I wanted to counteract what was said earlier, that in speaking of our own experiences, we're not uplifting our Black brothers and sisters. I think honestly, as a brown woman, that I am sharing my experiences because I'm saying they're not crazy, this is real, and it's happened to me too, and it's happened in this way. And I'm being very clear about it, and I don't know if you've received this letter, I sent it out, but if you haven't, ask for it and I will send it, okay? I'm gonna read a little bit from it before it ends, because I only have like 2-3 minutes, okay? So academia has been a ferocious battle where all these resources that we receive, like grants and all the fellowships, they're all great, but these have yet not protected me, nor my students, nor members of our staff from hate, punishment, harassment, retaliation, and bullying, with actions and common statements directly inflicting racial, sexual, class identity-based violence and hostility. And I'm talking about all types of hierarchization. Students come to me with things that professors go and do to them in the classroom. I know what you're doing in the classroom. Stop it. That is unacceptable. We can no longer do this to our students, because this same violence that killed a Black man in front of everybody and everybody watching him is the same thing we're doing in the classroom in a different dimension. It's a different dimension of the same thing. It's a different dimension where we're experiencing this type of hatred and violence and hierarchization and dehumanization in the heart, in the spirit, right? This is part of that whole plan. And how are you doing this to people in your classrooms? You should be ashamed of that. And you should try to understand, wait a minute, if people are telling me this is an issue, oh, look at her, Liliana, she's so uppity, because that's been said about me, she's uppity, uncivilized Mexican. She thinks she knows better. She makes us feel uncomfortable. Quiet her down. This kind of stuff. You need to know your place. What does that tell you about the place where we're at? Where instead of asking questions and saying, well, what do you mean? If someone came to me and told me, Liliana, I think that you're racist, I'll be like, please tell me how, and what did I do that gave you that impression? I would like to know. But no, that's not the reaction. The reaction is burn her, kill her, like end her, right? Sit her down, quiet her, calm her. And that has had its effects on me, emotionally, psychologically, and in my health. In the last 5 years that I've been working here at Cal State San Bernardino, even with all the support that I had from the dean, the provost, the president, the support that I had from my colleagues, I had to have colleagues come and save me from this shit. Besides all of that, I still was going through this crap, this invisible crap, this racism that is still gonna be there if we don't pay attention. You can report things. Okay, I report stuff. I will report things. What's going to happen? There are rules at the level of the CSU system that we can't go beyond. And these rules, guess what? They end up protecting people who are racist, sexist, homophobic, because the processes themselves were built and made in a way that protects people like that. And those people are still teaching, even when there is investigations on them by more than 5, 10, 15 students who have come forward. This needs to stop. You know what happens when these students are going through all that suffering? They go to people like me, and people like Larry Hygh, and people like Ahlam, Muhtaseb. They go to us And guess what we have to do? We have to advocate, write letters, please help this student. This is not fair, blah, blah, blah. And then guess what happens? They hate us for it. We get retaliation. They don't want, and I've heard things about colleagues being said, right? Like around me. Because of these reasons, they see us as their enemies. So I just want to end it there. You know, I have a lot more to say, I sent that email, those letters. Ask yourself the following questions. Try to make yourself more open to try to understand what this is. And if you cannot mention to me at least 5 different episodes in which people of color had to fight for their rights in this country, then you have to go back and read more history. And you cannot be discussing anything if you have no idea what you're even talking about. And this is a plea, a cry, a call for action within the self that I'm calling for. And I'm sure that the university will provide support for us to help educate our university in that sense, because it's really difficult. I almost left, but I'm here. So I'm now like, that's why I said, now I'm like a phoenix, and I'm a woman of color in flames. And if I don't get up and stand and say what I feel and think, and my perspective is rare. You rarely see someone in my position to be able to say these things in the way that I'm saying to you right now, right? Without fear and retaliation. I'm used to it. It's kind of like you're already used to it. I'm like a cholo, like a gangster now, you know? I'd rather be feared than be treated like I'm below. That's what happens, guys. That's what happens in the inner cities. That's what happens at another dimension, right? So thank you for having me here. I went over 2-3 minutes, but I really appreciate the time, this opportunity, and I'm looking forward to more opportunities like this where we can actually expand on our conversations and we can have people ask questions more thoroughly than today. And I hope this is a beginning for more of this. So thank you to the organization and Dean Chuang. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for just this really wonderful panel, and thanks for making this call of creating a more inclusive classroom where we can talk, where make our students' experience better, more inclusive. So it seems that we have about 10 minutes and we have about, let's see, 6 questions, and I don't know how many we will be able to address. So how about, let's just go ahead and read a few and let's see who among the panelists would address those questions. So let's go ahead and read the first question. Okay, I'm just reading it. Could one of the panelists contextualize the social phenomenon of calling the cops on POC, particularly blacks, for engaging in innocuous behavior? I mean, barbecuing in public park, bird watching, selling water, sleeping in a communal dorm, study room, etc. How might racially weaponized police reporting best be deterred? Should false 9/11 calls based on race be prosecuted as a hate crime? The power to be believed, especially by the law enforcement, is a privilege with a racial dimension. So I think I don't know how well I read it, but I got the question. So who do you want to take this question? Feel free. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead. Yeah, please.
So I think one of the things that it's important to remember is that racism is a set of beliefs, right, based on false information. So some might say it's a mental illness. In fact, I think many studies are headed that way. So you have to start with the premise that someone who believes that someone is less than them or less than other people merely because of their color of their skin is not, even though there are many systemic things that go into influencing that type of belief system, but that is somebody who is also not dealing entirely with reality. Does that make sense? Right. So we see these phone calls, we see this presumption of, this presumption of ownership over spaces, over bodies, over an entire law enforcement system. And then we see people trying to weaponize that, okay? Thankfully, we are now seeing that law enforcement as well as social media is helping us to say, oh yeah, no, actually this is incorrect. This is wrong. But this practice of white women calling law enforcement or calling a lynch mob in on African descended bodies predates Emmett Till, predates 1955, right? It has gone on for a very, 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 very long time. One of the things I think we're also starting to see is many people that are getting doxxed, right? They'll post something racist, and then the next day, social media has gotten this message back to their jobs and they're immediately fired. So again, I want to go back to this idea of mental instability and sort of ask, well, in this way, are people actually asking Black folks or people of good consciousness, anti-racist, to take the responsibility of getting them fired from their jobs on because there's something else that's going on and they want to use race or racism as this other way of not addressing the pain that they have going on. I mean, I think we talk a lot about the ways in which racism negatively affects people who are victims of it. But we also, I think, would be remiss if we didn't also acknowledge the fact that racism and this idea of every time I see somebody that's a certain skin color, I get afraid of them if I'm a white person, right? That also creates trauma and disease within the body, right? And has a destabilizing effect, right? We say racism is wrong, but racism is also a sickness. And I think realizing and recognizing that is something that's important as well.
Thank you. I think it's a really important observation. And I happen to think, and again, just my thinking, that I believe a significant number of people in the law enforcement, I think they might have to be, before even they come into the law enforcement, they might have that sense of entitlement. So they have they are entitled to save this country from all those problem population. And then with that motive, actually, they come to this profession, and then it actually clouds their judgment. And then we see them, the way they behave, So, and they brutalize the minorities, but especially the Blacks. So anyone wants to take this question? Anyone else? Okay, so let's see. Another question. We don't have a whole lot of time, but let's see whether we can take at least one more. Okay, so this one, let me read it. And okay, I see. Okay, so my next question is, our students of color are experiencing tremendous trauma right now. When we return to teaching in the fall, what are the resources that are available to help faculty with trauma-informed pedagogy? How can we support faculty who are also enduring trauma? So that's the question, and I invite the panelists and also Dean Chuang also, and if you can address that, because this is kind of a resource-related question.
Can I just say on this question with, just with this one, as far as experiencing the tremendous trauma, one of the things I've been able to do and that I've noticed with students is that when large nationwide events and traumas occur, just taking the time to listen at the start of your lectures. Even if you don't get to everything you had planned to get to at that time, just kind of opening up and showing them that you care and that you're there and that you are listening to them. I remember when Donald Trump was elected to office. And I was teaching at another institution with a very high population of Muslim students. And there was an outcry that some of his campaign statements and political promises would target certain groups of people, from LGBTQ people to Muslims to Hispanics, and those who were dreamers. And, you know, just having the available time, whether it's during your office hours or during your classes, just to listen and talk with the students, just to gauge how they feel about those situations, really, I found helps tremendously with that.
Okay. Anyone in the panel want to talk about how to deal with those trauma-driven students, and also if you are traumatized by yourself with what is going on now?
Okay, maybe I could address some of the question. I think there's no easy answer, right? I think one of the things is having this kind of open dialogue is very important. Even as we are having the panel presentation, we have the internet trolls, right, in the Q&A section. And I think that we as a college, and that's why I'm very committed, that we have that kind of open dialogue, even though I know it's kind of painful, even for some of our panelists, to share your thoughts. I feel your pain. And I think one of the things is for us to have that kind of very supportive environment and being committed to very open and supportive environment for our college. And in terms of providing resources for faculty, we'll continue to try to provide resources for our faculty. That's why when we're having to pivot to the online teaching environment, that's why I started form the online teaching committee for our faculty to provide the resources. And as Dr. Gallegos said, this is just the very beginning. I already envision we're gonna have multiple conversation as a college to address a lot of timely issues. You know, how do we instill critical pedagogy that address the oppressed, and how do we decolonize our curriculum, make our curriculum less Eurocentric. Actually, I was very devoted into that kind of research myself when I was a professor. And I'm hoping that one of the thing that I could do is actually for you to come and talk to me about what kind of resources you would like us to provide for you, and what kind of conversation that you would like to hear in our Cal Talk series, something like this. And this is just beginning. And I'm very sorry that we only have very few minutes for each panelist, because I want to provide that kind of diversity and inclusivity. That's why I try to invite every department's representative to join us. And I hope that in the future, we'll have more conversation like this, and we could provide as you know, possible channel, as much resources we could for our faculty in light of COVID-19, in light of possible cut. But I'm very committed to try to provide support for our faculty and staff and student, even though I may not have very, you know, a lot of resources, but my heart is here, that I hear you, I hear your concern, I hear your pain, I feel your pain, and I want to try to provide support as best as I can.
Thank you, Dean Chuang. May I add some thoughts? At what time are we supposed to be done?
It's 2:30. This time is up. So
okay, I
so
just want to say a few thoughts real quick. Okay, we need to have changes that are multiple and at the same time, simultaneous. So these changes have to come in the form of educating our faculty, students, staff, educating faculty more than anything, especially if they're going to be part of committees and making you know, and voting on them. So they need to be educated, at least in the history of the United States. Like, if you don't have an idea of that, then what are you doing? You know, number one. Number two, we need to go back and make a call to change the rules, to change how we deal with harassers and what I call identity-based terrorists, because that's what they are, and that should be illegal. You don't know the number of students whose lives have been deteriorated because the people who have been supposed to be their champions have actually affected the way that they saw academia. They have gone after them, bullying them to the point where they had to leave, and their whole lives are destroyed from this. And then they try to come back. This kind of stuff has happened, guys, where people come back and try to get revenge from someone who has hurt them in that way. So tell me if that should not be something that we should be paying attention to. Just like we pay attention to sexual harassment, and we're getting better at that, right? We're trying the same thing, the same illegal, it's a criminal thing to hurt people that way. So we should start talking about accountability, right? How are we going to deal with this situation so that we don't have it anymore, and be proactive about it? Ask the CSU system, do something. If we can't do it at our level because we're reaching a point where we can't push any further, then I say, let's take it to the CSU. But I'm really adamant about this, right? Please, let's not let this go, because we're still suffering these experiences regardless of whether or not you can see us suffering. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very, very much. So as a moderator, I am the timekeeper. So I'm positive that I might have done something wrong, but I really don't want to prolong that any longer. And in closing, I want to thank Dean Chuang for organizing this really important and timely talk. I want to thank all the panelists for participating and speaking from your heart, and showing us the way, you know, forward. And I also I'm so happy to see that about 90 people participated, and they asked questions, they forwarded different resources. So it was an involved panel, I must say. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating. And finally, I must thank David and Diana for from behind the scene. They are you know, from Dean's office, for running the Zoom and keeping us straightened throughout this time. Thank you very much. Thank you all. Have a nice day. Take care. Bye.